Hey guys, tonight we stroll through the dusty arteries of medieval Timbuktu, where salt glitters like silver and books whisper like royalty. It's a trade town unlike any other, nestled just shy of the Sahara's sweeping skirts, with mud brick facades squinting in the sun and goats sidestepping scattered scrolls. You arrive as the heat is still half asleep, rolling low and slow, licking at sandal straps and teasing the edges of turbans. The wind, meanwhile, smells like old figs and faint ambition. Donkeys trudge past, their saddlebags bursting not with spice or grain, but with manuscripts. Yes, that's how this world works. Scrolls are currency, ink is prestige, and parchment flows like gossip. You dodge a cart creaking under the weight of a dozen leather-bound folios wrapped in indigo cloth. One is rumored to contain legal commentary from a scholar who allegedly yelled at clouds twice. You pause at a market stall where books, not spices or swords, are the hot commodity. Traders prop up crooked wooden poles to shade their wares from the sun's baking fury. Over in the corner, someone's snorting beside a stack of texts worth more than your entire camel. And unless you brought backup goats as trade collateral, you probably won't survive the price of a decent astronomy primer. The trader eyes you suspiciously. He's in russet robes, his beard braided and tucked like he's hiding wisdom from the wind. On his table, Quranic commentary, a treatise on fig preservation, and a slim folio inscribed with diagrams of stars that might just be made up. He leans forward. "Smells like you want something educational," he says. You're not sure if that's a compliment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Timbuktu, by the 15th century, boasted one of the densest concentrations of manuscript libraries in the known world. Scholars here collected handwritten texts on law, philosophy, science, and religion. Some owned thousands, yes, thousands, rivaling monastic collections in Europe. A trader nearby lifts a manuscript and kisses its corner. It's bound in dyed leather, embossed with Arabic script so delicate it gleams like moonlight. You squint. Are those footnotes or celestial coordinates? He claims it's both. He adds, "This came from the South Quarter, the place where they iron their parchment." You don't ask. A camel snorts again, shifting beside a pile of scrolls wrapped in fish-skin casings designed to resist desert rain. It smells faintly of ambition and cured trout. Fringe tidbit? One scribe mixed his ink with tamarind and charcoal to make it smell like wisdom. It mostly smelled like tree bark and regret. You shuffle forward through rows of merchants bickering Songhai, Arabic, and the occasional accidental Latin. One scholar mutters about margins, another swears that Andalusian grammar is superior, citing a footnote that might just be sarcasm. There's an older man reading aloud from a page older than your ancestors. He's probably memorized 7 Qurans and 6 fig recipes. Nobody corrects him. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's manuscript economy was driven more by pure intellectual fervor or lucrative opportunism. Did they truly seek wisdom, or were rare scrolls status symbols wrapped in camel hide? The answer, of course, is yes. A boy no older than 10 recites legal theory beside a mango seller. He pauses only to balance the fruit and an ink pot. His delivery? Flawless. You consider asking what school he attends, but he's already quoting philosophy and strolling off like a tiny sage. You find a smooth stone ledge and sit. Around you, the marketplace hums like a thinking mind. Parchment flutters, sand shifts, and traders debate squiggles and punctuation with the intensity of diplomats. A man on your right starts arguing with someone invisible about whether margins are sacred. You nod. He's not wrong. As evening sidles in, casting long shadows across awnings patched with cloth and ambition, you feel it. Timbuktu's pulse. The market doesn't fade so much as whisper its way into silence. One trader rolls up his awning and says softly, "Tomorrow the stars speak through ink." You believe him.
You wander past sandal racks and scroll baskets, where the alley narrows and the chatter of syllables grows louder. Welcome to the scribal bloodstream of Sankore, Timbuktu's university, where walls remember arguments and corners hum with citation wars. The place doesn't have lecture halls or statues of past scholars. It has mud brick walls warmed by the sun and the persistent sound of calligraphy. Students huddle near fig trees, their robes dyed teal and saffron, parchment clutched like sacred relics. One is sketching a marginal note in furious brown ink while balancing a mango with surprising dexterity. Another mutters about punctuation and the metaphysics of commas. Nobody seems to agree, but everyone is absolutely certain. You settle beside a bench made of stone and theory. A nearby student recites the Mukaddima, tongue moving faster than reason. He pauses to correct himself. He'd mistakenly said economics when he meant social cohesion. The correction sparks debate, mostly involving a rival student who believed Ibn Khaldun was misunderstood and occasionally misquoted by ill-tempered scribes. Across the courtyard, a scribe smacks the ground with his quill, yelling, "No, the curve isn't divine," at someone you suspect may not actually exist. Fringe tidbit: some scribes claimed that divine inspiration occasionally corrected their strokes mid-writing. One even blamed an ink smudge on angelic intervention. His manuscript sold for triple. A lecturer leans out from a shaded archway, no podium in sight. He gestures broadly. "Ladies, gentlemen, other scribes, I ask you, does the moon require a footnote?" Half the circle nods. The other half groans. You're unsure which side you're on, but the discussion now involves a poem, 2 diagrams, and someone's grandmother's dream journal. Mainstream historical fact incoming. Sankore, established in the 14th century, operated as one of the leading centers of Islamic learning in all of Africa. It housed thousands of manuscripts and taught everything from astronomy and medicine to theology and math. Not in classrooms, but open courtyards, like the one you're currently sitting in. You dodge a flying date pit, hurled by a scholar at another who mistook mercantile for miracle. Their debate is not theological, it's grammatical. You blink and the argument is already about Andalusian syntax and whether footnotes should rhyme. You pass under a dusty archway where 2 scribes are furiously copying a legal treatise. Their coughs are suspiciously timed, passive-aggressive punctuation, weaponized sighs. Each stroke of their quill is a flex. The stakes? Pure prestige. The reward? Bragging rights and possibly a jar of roasted chickpeas. Someone whispers that a student developed his own ink recipe: charcoal, tamarind, and rainwater. It allegedly dried faster than a desert breeze and smelled like clarity. You lean close to a scroll and inhale. Mostly just bark. Maybe bark with ambition. Historians still argue whether Sankore's curriculum was rigorous or improv-heavy. Some say students followed prescribed scholarly paths. Others insist it was more like intellectual jazz, fluid, responsive, and always accompanied by figs. The air gets heavier, thick with syllables, and the slow drifting of meaning. Even the wind seems to pause before swirling someone's parchment off their lap. They catch it mid-air like a scholar turned ninja. No applause, just a muttered footnote correction. As twilight begins its quiet descent over Sankore's scribal avenues, you spot a boy scraping lines into the sand, his constellations precise enough for navigation, his transitions seamless. As you can see, these stars imply inheritance law. Nobody laughs, everybody nods. You rise and stretch, parchment crumbs sticking to your robe. You're still not sure whether divine punctuation exists, but you're beginning to suspect that in Timbuktu, even a comma has a destiny.
You hitch a ride, well, more like a staggered shuffle, beside a caravan gliding across Saharan sand, with all the grace of a camel stuck in a scroll sermon. The camels are lumpy, the drivers sunburnt, and the manuscripts wobble like delicate treasure strapped to beasts more concerned with bladder relief than academic preservation. You, meanwhile, are sweating through your robe, caught between awe and dehydration. This isn't just a journey, it's the backbone of Timbuktu's book economy. Convoys bearing knowledge across scorching dunes, scrolls tucked into fish-skin cases or dyed cloth bundles labeled "Do Not Smudge." The sun rises slowly, turning ink to oil in the heat, and you begin to wonder how anyone survives a Saharan road trip without hallucinating a poetic argument halfway to the next oasis. A camel snorts beside you, perhaps offended by your shallow understanding of 14th century transport logistics. Its saddle is rigged with manuscripts on astronomy, law, and fig storage strategies. Fringe tidbit: one legendary trader allegedly wrapped his favorite parchment in cured camel skin and rubbed the casing with garlic as protection from desert spirits. This tradition lasted exactly one generation. Mainstream historical fact: caravans, often led by Tuareg or Arab guides, transported manuscripts across vast desert routes, connecting Timbuktu's intellectual elite to far-flung centers of learning from Marrakesh to Cairo. These book-bearing journeys spanned weeks and risked storms, raids, and occasional camel tantrums. You ride beside a scholar with a fondness for dramatic size. "This folio," he says, stroking a scroll like it's a sleeping child, "was copied by a man who only wrote while chewing clove bark. That's how he stayed focused." You nod respectfully. He is clearly full of dehydrated wisdom. Some camels carry crates engraved with geometric designs, allegedly meant to deter theft through intimidation by symmetry. Whether it works is anyone's guess. One guard spends 20 minutes debating whether to load the manuscripts straight on or sideways for optimal manuscript feng shui. Historians still argue whether these caravans prioritized book preservation or trade volume. Did they guard scrolls with loving reverence, or just toss them onto camel humps and hope the ink survived the wobble? The truth? A bit of both. You stop at a dusty outpost where traders sip dates and scribes argue over calligraphy in a tone normally reserved for politics. A boy offers you a salted fig. You accept it, mostly out of fear.
He asks you what you know about parchment absorption rates. You pretend to cough. As the caravan resumes, the sun softens slightly, casting long shadows over camel legs and stitched manuscript wraps. You spot a trader securing his texts with twine and muttering blessings in Arabic. Another is quietly singing a poem about the stars and taxes, possibly both. This, you realize, is a very scholarly commute. As the dunes roll back toward Timbuktu, the caravan pulls closer to the city's mud brick edge. The camels groat, the scholars stretch, and you tuck a borrowed scroll under your robe, not to steal, but to feel its weight, like holding a whisper from another century.
You drift into a courtyard shaded by scribal chaos and fig trees with attitude. Here, knowledge doesn't walk, it sprints while balancing snacks. A young student sits cross-legged beside a stone bench, an open manuscript before him, and a mango precariously perched on one knee. His other hand grips an inkpot like it's made of secrets. This is peak Sancore academia. Fruity multitasking meets cerebral fire. He's reciting a passage from a philosophy treatise, voice steady, vowels crisp. Midway through, he pauses, not for dramatic flair, but because the mango begins to slip. Without missing a beat, he adjusts it and continues reciting, now outlining the ethical implications of trade embargoes, using a metaphor that involves goat cheese. You are deeply impressed. Next to him, a passing scholar overhears the lecture and launches a tangential rant about the virtues of diagonal pen strokes, claiming they channel spiritual symmetry. The student nods politely, while another scholar nearby rolls his eyes and mutters that the diagonal obsession is just geometric vanity. It's unclear if anyone's listening or just preparing their rebuttal. Fringe tidbit. In Timbuktu, mangoes were known to accompany study sessions, not just for snacking, but allegedly to absorb excess heat from heated debates. One poetic scholar swore mango placement enhanced memory retention. You wonder if he was just hungry. Ink-stained fingers flutter everywhere. Robes of russet and teal shift as students lean over parchments, scribbling notes and margin doodles. You notice someone drawing a camel in medieval chainmail. No explanation is offered. You don't ask. Mainstream historical fact. Sankore's courtyards were a hub for intellectual improvisation. Instead of formal classrooms, lessons unfolded across benches, steps, and occasionally near goat pens. Subjects ranged from grammar and astronomy to theology and agriculture, with frequent detours into metaphysics and mango economics. Nearby, a quill snaps dramatically. Its owner gasps as though he's just failed to impress the metaphoric jury of scrondal ancestors. A replacement quill appears, courtesy of a fellow scribe who insists the previous one lacked appropriate ink absorption fidelity. This sparks another debate, which somehow loops back to punctuation theology. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's scholarly debates were earnest academic efforts or theatrical performance art designed to impress visiting traders. The answer is probably written in someone's commentary, but nobody agrees on whose. A goat wanders by, eyes full of unearned confidence. It sniffs the inkpot, headbutts a scroll, and keeps walking. No one bats an eye. You begin to understand that here drama is woven into the pursuit of knowledge like sand into sandals. You shift again on your bench. The student beside you asks if you've ever considered the moral implications of ink formulation. You blink. He smiles. He says, "Charcoal binds judgment, while tamarind binds memory." You murmur agreement, just as another voice calls from across the courtyard, asking if anyone's seen the fig-scented grammar scroll. Someone responds by flinging a mango peel with shocking accuracy. It lands gently atop a legal manuscript. Nobody laughs. Everyone nods. You think back to your first step into the scribal streets, where every sentence felt whispered and sacred. Now, surrounded by debate, laughter, and fruit-stained parchment, you realize sacred isn't solemn here. It's spirited, slightly sticky, and wildly alive. As the shadows stretch gently across mud brick edges, the student beside you finishes his passage. He tucks the mango under one arm, lifts his scroll, and walks off like someone carrying the weight of civilization, plus a snack.
You round a parchment-strewn corner and nearly collide with a scribe whose robes billow like an angry punctuation mark. He's yelling at volume and velocity normally reserved for diplomatic crises about someone confusing mercantile with miracle. The accused apprentice stands with trembling hands and a blotch of ink on his nose. This, clearly, is war. Around them, the scribal scene burns bright with passive aggression. Quills slash through parchment like sabers, elbows jab in cramped corners. One man snorts with enough disdain to sandblast a manuscript. You've entered the realm of scroll squabbles, where intellectual tension gets inked in margins and egos fly faster than sandstorms. Two rival copiers sit under a faded awning, racing to replicate a pristine version of a legal treatise. Every stroke is judgment. One lets out an exaggerated cough whenever the other finishes a line. The gesture says, "Wrong." You don't ask what the treatise covers. It's likely mundane inheritance law. But to these two, it's the Iliad. Fringe tidbit? A well-documented rivalry once ended when a scribe left a sarcastic marginalia in the final copy of his opponent's manuscript. This footnote smells of laziness. The opponent retaliated by inventing 5 new diacritical marks. None caught on. Elsewhere, a scholar picks through scrolls muttering about calligraphic lineage. If the curve doesn't echo Fatimide elegance, what's the point? He says, flicking a piece of fig skin off the page. His mustache twitches with irritation, a common side effect of stylistic purism. And yes, Timbuktu's ink merchants were known to judge penmanship with the same gravity they judged facial hair. Mainstream historical fact. Copying manuscripts in Timbuktu was more than transcription. It was art, reputation, and high-stakes craftsmanship. Scribes were trained over years, apprenticed through ink-stained hierarchies, and often developed signature flourishes identifiable across cities. You spot a trader showing off a scroll from that one district where they use millet in their ink. He says it adds texture. You feel the page. It does. You accidentally sneeze. The trader gasps. The scroll is swiftly swaddled in cloth, kissed, and gently returned to its box. Your apology is ignored in favor of protective incantations. Historians still argue whether the aggressive pride among scribes was a symptom of prestige, insecurity, or the sheer chaos of competing for literate glory in a market that prized words like gold. Most likely, all three. Nearby, a scholar shakes his scroll at a parrot who keeps quoting miscopied aphorisms. The parrot squawks, "All llamas are wise!" and everyone groans. The phrase appears nowhere in the Quran, philosophy, or meteorology. The bird is escorted out. You duck beneath a dried palm awning and rest beside a pile of ruined drafts. One page reads, "Truth may be squiggly, but it must be legible." Another has a coffee-colored inkblot shaped vaguely like a goat. You wonder if it's accidental or symbolic. As the sun winks low across Sankare's rooftops, the scribal chaos settles, but only slightly. One copier wraps his scroll with triumphant flair, while his rival, clutching a smudged final line, sighs deeply and whispers, "Tomorrow I use the fish-skin brush." You stand, ears full of verbal daggerwork and theological typography. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you start imagining a quiet cottage, but you know that wouldn't smell this rich with ink, debate, and distant mango logic.
A messenger stumbles into the courtyard, breathless and sun-drenched, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle with the caution of someone holding live philosophy. He doesn't speak, just sets the parcel down on a cracked stone table as the crowd around him goes suddenly hush-hush. You lean in as he begins to unwrap it like a sacred relic or roasted lamb. Inside is a folio unlike anything you've seen. The pages are smooth, almost glassy, bound with fish skin that gleams faintly in the light. It smells like wisdom soaked in brine. You wrinkle your nose. Others nod with reverence. The manuscript's script is a crisp blend of elegance and ambition. Each letter straight enough to shame a ruler and ornate enough to make a peacock insecure. The trader who receives it lets out a breath that sounds suspiciously poetic. "This was carried through storm," he murmurs. "It swam, practically." Fringe tidbit: water-resistant folio casings were real, made with fish skin, cured leather, and the tears of apprentices. Well, maybe not the tears, but you're not ruling it out. You run a finger gently along one margin, where diagrams blossom like intellectual doodles. One shows planetary movement. Another depicts legal inheritance using nested goats. Someone says it came from the southern quarter, the part of Timbuktu where they iron parchment with heated stones. You ask why. They respond with a shrug. Respect. Mainstream historical fact: Timbuktu wasn't just a scholarly town, it was a logistical masterpiece of manuscript handling. Traders and scholars crafted custom cases, scroll wraps, and ink recipes to withstand desert travel. Some were so precise they rivaled European conservatories in preservation techniques. The messenger finally speaks. The stars marked its arrival. Everyone nods solemnly, though you suspect half the room would say that about their breakfast menu. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's manuscript customs were driven by genuine academic care or obsessive aesthetics. Were these elaborate wrappers practical or flexes wrapped in parchment? Answer: wrapped in both. A scribe nearby tilts his head and squints at the folio. Letter spacing, he mutters. Aggressive. I like it. Another snorts. Too proud. It reads like it wants a parade. You tuck this moment away as your personal definition of literary critique. The trader finishes inspecting the bundle, sprinkles a pinch of fig dust near the manuscript's edge, and slides it reverently into a clay jar lined with soft, woven cloth. You wonder what it's like to carry something so valuable that you'd argue with sand over grain damage. You shift back, listening to the hum of Sankore fade briefly into awe. The messenger, now empty-handed, is offered a sweet drink and a side-eye from someone clearly unimpressed with his sandals. Prestige, you discover, begins at the ankles. As twilight deepens and the parchment glows faintly in its jar, you realize you've watched a moment both mundane and miraculous. A manuscript arrived. It survived. It might outlive the courtyard, the traders, even the fish. And you're grateful you got to sniff it.
You duck through a narrower alley and enter a quieter quarter of the city, where fig leaves rustle overhead and soft sand cushions every step. The marketplace clamor fades behind you, replaced by murmured verses, the tapping of quills, and sandal scuffs that sound almost like punctuation. Welcome to Timbuktu's whisper network of poets, a realm where words are passed gently, sometimes secretly, like recipes for emotional resonance. You ease beside a clay wall scribbled with coded verses. One reads, "She spoke in syllables, tucked behind salt." Another, "The moon, jealous, stole his ink." Whether love, grief, or mango envy is the theme, you're unsure, but a robed figure nearby nods solemnly. "That one's about sandstorms and heartbreak," he whispers. You don't challenge the interpretation. Nearby, a cluster of poets trade lines while roasting figs over a modest clay flame. One uses an ink made of beetroot and nostalgia. Another claims his rhyme is legally binding in 2 emirates and 1 caravan union. Fringe tidbit? Timbuktu's poetic salons often featured veiled wordplay, a tradition of coded critique where desert wind could mean tax hikes and candle smoke might hint at bureaucratic betrayal. Mainstream historical fact: poetry in Timbuktu flourished as both artistic expression and intellectual debate. Scholars often composed verses to convey theological insights, moral dilemmas, or political commentary, all wrapped in metaphor and meter. These exchanges occasionally replaced formal declarations, making metaphor the language of diplomacy. A trader joins the group, quoting a line from a manuscript he claims was ghostwritten by a blind mystic who dictated in 4 dialects. Someone challenges his pronunciation. It escalates briefly into a pun-off. You witness a fig thrown in protest. Historians still argue whether this poetic culture served primarily as creative escape or subtle resistance. Was it leisure or layered activism? Perhaps just scholars flexing their emotional depth between footnotes? Answer:
dusted with all three. You spot a young girl balancing a scroll on her head while reciting poetry about the color saffron. A nearby elder nods as if she just explained the cosmos. You smile. She tosses a roasted fig at you. You catch it and pretend the gesture was profound. Under an arch carved with verses and vine motifs, a poet pulls you aside and asks what the breeze told you today. You think for a moment and reply, that silence isn't empty. He beams and scribbles it down. Good, he says, might rhyme with philosophy. As dusk settles, the whisper network wraps up. Scrolls are tucked away in dyed cloth. One poet kisses his inkwell and hums a farewell verse. Let the stars forget our name, so we may write it again tomorrow. You nod, feeling the hush settle deep into your robe's folds. Words here aren't shouted, they linger, and like roasted figs, they sweeten with time. You tiptoe through a courtyard where sandal prints outline scholarly ambition, and sunlight bounces off clay like a particularly aggressive metaphor. Under the fig tree at the center, a teacher squats beside a circle of robed students, drawing constellations with a stick in the sand. His hand moves like rhythm incarnate, graceful arcs for Orion, measured dots for Vega, swirls for something possibly fictional but emotionally accurate. You listen closely. The lecture begins with star charts and gravitational metaphors, but then swerves, smooth as silk, into inheritance law. Now, as you can see, the teacher says, tapping at a cluster of sandy stars, your uncle's goat should go to your cousin, provided the moon was waxing when he signed the will. Everyone nods. Nobody asks for clarification. A student raises a skeptical brow. The teacher smiles. What are stars but contracts written by fire? It's unclear whether this is allegory or legally binding. Fringe tidbit? Some instructors in Sancore were known to teach multiple subjects in parallel, using visual metaphors drawn directly into sand or onto mud brick walls. One legendary scholar taught theology, geometry, and fig pricing policies using nothing but a reed stick and interpretive head tilts. Robes rustle. Ink-smudged scrolls lie beside wicker baskets of dates and tamarind candies, likely bribes in a philosophical sense. A passing goat interrupts briefly, then leaves, as if unimpressed by the celestial argument. Mainstream historical fact, Sancore scholars believed knowledge should integrate disciplines. Astronomy wasn't taught in isolation. It shared space with law, trade, and agriculture. The stars guided caravans, but also inspired contract clauses and metaphorical livestock inheritance. You scribble a few notes in your borrowed scroll, only to be corrected by a student who claims your depiction of the North Star looks more like a mosquito. You nod respectfully. He's probably memorized half the night sky. Historians still argue whether this interdisciplinary approach was brilliance or confusion. Did scholars weave constellations into contract law because of deep insight, or because someone left their astronomy folio in a legal scroll wrapper? Maybe it's just Timbuktu logic. Everything overlaps, especially when sandal scuffs erase the syllabus. The teacher finishes drawing a constellation goat with notably assertive horns.
And that, my children, he says softly, is the celestial case for cousin Abdul. Everyone applauds quietly, like they're congratulating gravity. As the sun leans toward evening, reed screens cast long shadows on the courtyard sand. Scrolls are rolled, clay mugs are lifted, and someone begins reciting a poem that starts with, "When Venus audits your inheritance." You never hear the rest. A fig pit lands nearby, and the recitation pauses for snack redistribution. You rise, brush sand off your robe, and glance at the smudged star map. Somehow, it makes you feel both wise and like you've accidentally entered a cosmic debate about goats. Around you, Sankore keeps buzzing, quietly, rhythmically, forever drawing connections where other cities saw separation.
You find yourself lounging on a low stone step beside a trader wrapped in indigo robes that look older than certain empires. He's deep in conversation with a fellow merchant, both leaning over a bundle of folios that sparkle faintly in the heat. Their topic? The great mystery of Timbuktu's book market. Is it driven by true pursuit of knowledge, or simply a way to flex with golden scripted scrolls and fancy footnotes? One of them insists that this particular manuscript, a slim volume titled On Justice and Lentils, was copied by a blind scribe using pure instinct and calligraphic vengeance. The other snorts, claiming it's just a shopping list disguised in moral poetry. You sip water and pretend to nod wisely. They pivot to the economics of it all. A decent book, says the first merchant, costs more than 3 healthy cows and a goat with conversational skills. You're unsure how literal that last part is. But the sentiment stands. Parchment is expensive, and ownership of rare texts is prestige incarnate. Fringe tidbit? Some scholars hoarded books not for reading, but for decoration. One infamous bibliophile arranged his scrolls by color, had them perfumed weekly, and reportedly read none, except those containing fig recipes. Mainstream historical fact? Timbuktu's manuscript trade was both intellectual and status-driven. While scholars genuinely sought knowledge, traders and elites collected texts to showcase literacy, wealth, and lineage. Collections were curated to rival libraries from Cairo to Cordoba. A scribe passes by, muttering about false gilding and fake Andalusian embossing. Apparently, forgery in manuscript decoration was a real issue, and traders would inspect bindings like jewelers hunting flaws. You overhear someone describe a volume as subtly arrogant, the highest compliment possible. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's manuscript craze leaned toward sincere scholarship or ostentatious collecting. Was it devotion to ideas or the medieval version of flex culture? The truth dances in ink. Perhaps both. A robed man nearby lifts a scroll so delicately it's like he's cradling philosophy's first whisper. He shows it off to an interested buyer with a flourish that would make magicians jealous. They haggle not over the content, but the clarity of pen strokes and whether the marginalia complements the manuscript's emotional symmetry. You pass a stall featuring texts arranged in pyramids. The trader claims it's symbolic of transcendent hierarchy. You suspect it's just good marketing. But people gather anyway, debating whether law should sit above astronomy or whether poetry deserves the topmost perch. As the sun casts parchment-colored light over Sankor's west-facing walls, the traders begin packing up. Scrolls wrapped in dyed cloth, sealed with wax, or kissed gently at the corners. A man hums a tune about taxes and manuscripts. You feel strangely moved. You stand,
and the trader beside you offers a nod. The market, he says, isn't about price, it's about proof. You raise an eyebrow. Proof of what? He grins. Proof that you still care who wrote the margins.
You follow the rhythmic clop of hooves down a winding alley where the books ride donkeys like royalty. Each beast lumbers with dignified exhaustion, its saddlebags stuffed not with grain or bricks, but with folios wrapped in indigo cloth and fish skin casing. You blink. This is Timbuktu's donkey library, mobile, grouchy, and deeply literate. A courier calls out in 3 languages, waving away a child who tries to pet a scroll. The donkey grunts in protest, as if protecting its cargo from sticky fingers and philosophical misunderstandings. You watch a trader slide a manuscript from the saddle pouch with ceremonial flair, kiss its corner, and whisper a prayer you suspect references both Allah and pagination. One of the beasts pauses at a water trough and nearly tips over, top-heavy with texts about inheritance law, celestial navigation, and the ethical use of fig paste. You murmur condolences. It spits politely. Fringe tidbit? Some couriers train donkeys to recognize specific delivery routes based on scent trails, mostly ink and smoked tamarind. One particularly dramatic handler claimed his lead donkey could recite proverbs if bribed with dried fruit. Nobody confirmed this. Mainstream historical fact: in Timbuktu, donkeys were a common and trusted means of transporting manuscripts across the city and its outskirts. Their reliability in desert terrain and ability to carry fragile goods made them essential to the book economy's pulse. You fall into step behind a trio of scroll-bearing animals, listening to the soft thunk of bound knowledge against wicker saddle flaps. A young scholar jogs alongside, muttering footnotes into the dust. Every few steps he pauses to adjust a strap, as if worried the cosmos will misalign if the legal treatise isn't level. Historians still argue whether donkeys were chosen for durability or affordability, or whether the whole literary transport system was just wonderfully absurd. Either way, the image of a manuscript-laden animal lumbering through alleyways feels like both poetic metaphor and logistical genius. A trader waves you down. He says, "Help me translate this title," he points to a leather-bound volume perched on a donkey's back. You squint. The script is ornate, stylized, possibly upside down? He adds, "It might be about ethics, or oranges, or moral ambiguity shaped like fruit." You nod sagely and suggest both. Further down the alley, a donkey decorated with crimson tassels carries a bundle described as one scholar's life work and one accidental cookbook. The rider assures you it's not mixed up. You're skeptical, especially when you spot a recipe for mango stew in a scroll labeled "The Limits of Reason." As the sky begins to dim and reed screens cast checkered shadows across the sandy path, the donkey library heads toward its final delivery, a merchant's personal archive built into the back of a clay home. You peer inside, shelves of text organized by whim and weight, candles flickering, the scent of date ink hanging in the air. You exhale. There's something profoundly humbling about the quiet dignity of beasts bearing books. They don't read. They don't debate. But without them, Timbuktu's scrolls would gather dust in forgotten corners. You reach out to gently pat one donkey's side. It snorts, entirely unimpressed. But
It trudges onward, and so does the parchment. You squeeze through a crooked wooden gate and find yourself inside a scholar's private hoard, an archive so overflowing it resembles a chaotic shrine to literacy. Scrolls poke from wicker baskets, manuscripts lean against mud brick walls like sunbathing serpents, and random parchment scraps flutter from rafters with the energy of half-remembered dreams. Somewhere, a rooster perches on the ethics of cheese and looks judgmental. This isn't a library. It's a living labyrinth of logic and obsession. The scholar who owns it, wrapped in a robe of russet and indigo, with a beard like punctuation, greets you with the enthusiasm of someone about to explain footnote theory for 6 uninterrupted hours. You brace yourself. He insists that every scroll in this room has a heartbeat. One contains a recipe for fig bread, allegedly dictated by a poet in a fever dream. Another is a treatise on lunar justice that references goats in 13 footnotes. You ask why. He grins. Alignment. Fringe tidbit? Some private collections in Timbuktu reached such volume they required literal maps to navigate. One scholar labeled shelves with poetic metaphors like ladder of law, shelf of sleepy stars, and corner of mild regret. Visitors often got lost between taxation in trade routes and how to bark politely at camels. Mainstream historical fact. Wealthy scholars and traders in Timbuktu amassed libraries of hundreds, sometimes thousands of manuscripts, spanning law, astronomy, literature, medicine, and theology. These collections rivaled European monastic libraries in scope and sophistication. The scholar shows you a scroll wrapped in silk, embroidered with geometric designs. He whispers, "This one argued against bread taxation using allegorical livestock." You nod, partly impressed, mostly hungry. Historians still argue whether these private libraries were expressions of intellectual devotion, status symbols, or just the only acceptable form of hoarding. Likely all three, with a sprinkle of showmanship and enough footnotes to shame a modern academic. You trip over a volume labeled Selected Gossip from the South Gate. The scholar sighs. Ah, yes, my recreational shelf. He slides it aside and reveals On Moral Geometry, illustrated with turban-wearing triangles. You blink. He beams. In one corner, a ladder leads to an upper platform, so cluttered it feels like a papery mountain of ambition. A goat tries to climb it. The scholar shoos it away. "Not today, Jamal," he says, and the goat ambles off with theatrical disappointment. You take a moment to admire the quiet madness. The air smells of ink and fig dust and intellectual intensity. Every scroll crackles with the electricity of centuries. You reach for a slim folio. Your fingers hover above the cover like a hesitant pilgrim. The scholar chuckles. "That one bites back," he says. You smile. You believe him.
You hear it before you see it. A low chant drifting over Sankary's rooftops, brushed with wind and syllables, soft as a bedtime verse murmured to parchment. The marketplace begins to hush, not all at once, but like a scholar reaching the end of a complicated sentence. Scrolls pause mid-consultation, quills still. Even the goats seem unusually contemplative. You drift toward the heart of the courtyard as shadows stretch like ink stains across mud brick. Scholars start packing up. Manuscripts kissed at the corners, rolled in indigo cloth, tucked into clay jars like precious secrets. One scribe mutters a farewell to his commentary on lunar justice and places it beneath a reed screen. You suspect it sleeps there nightly. A boy rewinds his scroll with exaggerated care, his fingers soft as silk. He whispers, "Tomorrow we debate bread metaphors." You nod solemnly. That sounds intense. Nearby, a trader in teal robes wraps up his final folio and murmurs, "May wisdom travel safely, even through fig storms." You're unsure whether fig storms are literal or poetic, but the sentiment feels sincere. Fringe tidbit? Scholars sometimes stored scrolls in hollowed gourds lined with parchment scraps to imbue the container with literacy. Some gourds were even named. One particularly famous vessel was dubbed Cousin Jabir. Nobody knows why. Mainstream historical fact: at day's end, manuscript markets in Timbuktu would soften in tone. The hum of debate gave way to quiet rituals of preservation, binding, blessing, storing. Many texts were placed in secure niches or passed between family members as scholarly inheritance. You sit beside a clay wall etched faintly with quotes, "Ink fades, memory stumbles, but truth naps lightly." Another reads, "Grammar is the camel of clarity." You begin to suspect that someone wrote a scroll entirely composed of metaphoric animals. You would read that scroll. Historians still argue whether these evening rituals were driven by reverence or superstition. Was it habit, hope, or just sleepy scholars leaning poetic? Perhaps in Timbuktu, preservation was simply another kind of prayer. A poet hums a tune and adjusts his sandal straps. A scholar ties a ribbon around a tightly wound scroll, kisses it gently, and places it in a wooden box that smells faintly of mango and ink. You watch it close like a metaphor folding in on itself. The chant grows stronger now, pouring from Sankary's dome in layers of syllables. You don't understand every word, but it settles into your bones like soft certainty. Around you, the courtyard sighs, not with exhaustion, with contentment. You stand. The air is cooler now, tinged with parchment and contemplation. A trader passes with a scroll tucked into his robe like contraband. You nod. He nods. Nothing is said. Everything is understood. And tomorrow, the syllables rise again.
You trail a student, just old enough to question everything, but young enough to still eat scroll crumbs without realizing it. His robe is crooked, his sandals mismatched, and his parchment clutched with a grip that suggests both reverence and terror. You suspect this is his first solo rewrite mission, and it's personal. He settles beneath a low clay arch, unfurling a scroll that's been annotated, corrected, and possibly sneezed on by half of Sankare's faculty. His inkpot wobbles on a flat stone. His quill looks like it's seen war, but his eyes? Fierce, determined, and just slightly mango sticky. He begins. Slow, steady strokes of brown ink along faint guidelines traced by an elder. Each curve is deliberate, each dot a minor existential crisis. You watch as he mouths the words silently, as if spelling out truth with every breath. Fringe tidbit: Some novice scribes believed whispering while copying improved legibility. One theory claimed scrolls absorbed intention. Another insisted it was just polite. An elder passes, tilts his head approvingly, then casually tosses a scrap of critique that reads, "Line 3 resembles emotional confusion." The student squints, rewrites it, and mutters a prayer that might be directed toward clarity, saints, or calligraphic redemption. Mainstream historical fact: Timbuktu's scribal apprentices trained under masters for years, learning not only how to copy faithfully, but how to preserve semantic nuance. A single misplaced mark could alter theology or insult someone's grandmother. You lean closer and inhale faint tamarind vapor. His ink recipe? Self-mixed, charcoal, rainwater, and tree bark. Supposedly dries fast, smells wise, smells mostly dusty, but you admire the effort. Historians still argue whether scribal learning in Sankore followed strict pedagogies or free-form chaos. Were novices guided by a curriculum or by a mystical soup of mentorship, experimentation, and fig-based bribery? The student's tongue pokes from the side of his mouth in intense concentration. He finishes the page with a flourish so proud it nearly causes ink to weep. Then, slowly, he rolls the scroll. He kisses its corner. He tucks it inside his robe like contraband, like legacy. You follow him through dusk-glowing alleys, past walls etched with scribbled advice. Never copy sleepy. Margins judge you silently, and truth is tidy. He walks taller now, one hand brushing against his robe where the scroll rests like a quiet heartbeat. And tomorrow, maybe he teaches. Maybe he copies another. Or maybe he just eats mango with philosophical intensity. You slow your steps as dusk deepens, strolling past mud-brick facades whose surface hums with the quiet residue of centuries. Faint scribbles adorn the walls, some quotes, some complaints, one furious sentence about quill quality. The city exhales around you. Timbuktu's marketplace may sleep, but the bricks whisper stories no ledger ever captured. A soft breeze lifts sand and syllables into the air. Somewhere nearby, someone recites a line about truth riding wind. You don't see them, but you nod anyway. The scent of fig pits and parchment ink wafts through the alley, mixing with the occasional rustle of a lizard skittering over dried scroll wrappers. You pause at a clay niche containing a single scroll tucked into folded cloth. The trader calls it a whisper for rainy days. Inside, diagrams map trade routes using metaphorical birds. You lean close. One route is labeled Swan with envy. You don't ask questions. Fringe tidbit? Hidden caches of manuscripts, buried in walls, stashed in clay jars, or tucked beneath reed screens, were common in Timbuktu during political unrest. Some collections have been discovered centuries later, still legible, still brilliant, still covered in a faint layer of dust and defiance. Mainstream historical fact. During invasions and upheavals, scholars and families worked to preserve manuscripts by hiding them.
These small, often forgotten archives played a vital role in ensuring intellectual survival across generations. A child walks past, holding a scroll like it's a bedtime story. His footsteps echo softly, padding through alleys lined with ancient texts and even older questions. You glance up at a wall that reads, "Love edits slowly." You smile. You believe it. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's literary spirit vanished with the decline of the marketplace or whether it simply curled into quieter corners. Less spectacle, more reflection. Was the fall a true ending or just a nap between pages? You settle on a worn ledge where a scholar once reportedly slept beside his manuscript hoard to guard dreams from entropy. The stone is warm from the sun's earlier affection. Around you, mud brick murmurs and manuscripts breathe through cracks in the walls. You let your fingers trail across a parchment scrap embedded in the clay. The words are faded, the meaning half lost, but it feels alive. You don't read it aloud. You don't need to. Timbuktu speaks softly now, but it still speaks.
You drift once more into the edges of the marketplace, where awnings sag and traders shuffle scrolls with the tenderness of bedtime lullabies. The cobblestone beneath your feet feels faded, worn, not from neglect, but from centuries of purpose. Timbuktu's book market is curling inward, slowly snoozing like a scholar with ink-stained dreams. Stalls that once buzzed with debate now echo in whispers. A merchant folds his parchment canopy with the reverence of wrapping a newborn idea. Another stacks manuscripts inside wicker baskets lined with cloth embroidered in poetic script. "Let ink guide the weary," one corner reads. You sigh. That's the mood. A scribe nearby hums softly as he seals a scroll. No debates tonight, just preservation. His apprentice nods, lips pursed in sleepy approval. They close a crate with a whispered Bismillah and a shared glance that says the stars are watching. Fringe tidbit: some traders believed manuscripts absorbed emotion during the day and needed quiet overnight storage. Scrolls were even rested, facing east to invite morning clarity. One eccentric merchant claimed his texts dreamed verse during full moons. Mainstream historical fact: the Timbuktu manuscript economy began its slow decline due to political disruption, shifting trade routes, and external pressures like Moroccan invasion and colonial interference. Yet for generations, the culture lingered. In private homes, in whispered scholarship, in closets lined with parchment prayers. You watch a scholar brush sand from his final folio and tuck it into a clay jar. It's silent now, but you imagine the day's debates humming in every fiber. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's literary collapse was sudden or gradual. Was it stifled by conquest or gently quieted by time? Perhaps both? Perhaps neither. A trader pauses beside you. "See that wall?" he asks,
pointing to a crumbling structure etched with script. "That was once my father's shop. He sold dreams disguised as dictionaries." You chuckle. He doesn't. He's serious. You walk a final circuit around the sleeping stalls. No laughter now, no squabbles over grammar or mango ink. Just closed crates, folded awnings, and scrolls swaddled like stories waiting for their next breath. A donkey passes with an empty saddle. Even it looks reflective. You find a smooth ledge. Lower yourself slowly and let the quiet settle in your bones. Around you, the book market slumbers. Not dead, just resting. Waiting for someone to whisper footnotes again. Because in Timbuktu, even silence has chapters.